You know, at first glance, this might look like just some old, unassuming piece of parchment. But what if I told you that this single document, written over 800 years ago, completely changed the way we think about power, justice, and freedom? So, how on earth did that happen? Let's get into it. This is the Magna Carta, which literally means the Great Charter. And we're talking about a document whose ideas have inspired leaders and movements across centuries, from Thomas Jefferson drafting the Declaration of Independence all the way to Mahatma Gandhi and his fight for India's freedom. And that's really the big question we're tackling. How does a failed peace treaty between a truly terrible king and his very angry nobles end up shaping the laws and rights that so many of us cherish today? Well, to figure that out, we've got to rewind the clock way back to 11th century England. So our story doesn't actually start in 1215 with the charter itself. It starts way earlier, in a kingdom that was forged by conquest and defined by absolute power. We have to understand the world that made something like the Magna Carta not just possible, but absolutely necessary. Okay, so back in 1066, when William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings, he didn't just win a crown. He completely remade England. He set up this very rigid feudal system where basically all the land, and because of that, all the power, flowed directly from him. His top nobles, the barons, they got land in exchange for loyalty and soldiers, but make no mistake, the king's authority was absolute. And this whole setup, well, it was basically paving the way for a huge power struggle down the road. All right, let's fast forward about 130 years. And now, on the throne, we find a man, well, a man who many historians would argue is one of the worst kings in all of English history, King John. And just look at this list. It's almost like a how-to guide on being a terrible monarch. He loses these huge, critical territories in France, lands his family had held for ages, and earns this humiliating nickname, Soft Sword. Then, to pay for his failing wars, he just squeezes his barons with these insane, unpredictable taxes. If they pushed back, he'd take their land or toss them in jail without any kind of legal process. And then you get to the personal stuff. I mean, allegedly murdering his own nephew, starving his opponents to death. This went way beyond bad leadership. This was outright tyranny. So yeah, eventually, the barons just had enough. And we're not talking about a few grumpy nobles complaining in a corner. Nope, this was a full-blown, organized rebellion. And what they did next was a huge deal. They formed an army, marched on London, and captured it. This crippled the king because London was the financial and political heart of the whole kingdom. But here's the crucial part. Their goal wasn't actually to overthrow him. They wanted to force him to obey the law of the land, to finally put some kind of check on his absolute power. So you can just imagine the scene, right? The king and his court on one side, and this army of angry, rebellious barons on the other. They meet on this neutral ground, a meadow called Runnymede, to negotiate. And the result of those incredibly tense negotiations, written down by the king's own people, became the document we now call the Magna Carta. So here we have it, the Great Charter. And you have to remember, this wasn't some lofty philosophical essay on liberty. It was way more practical. It was basically a list of demands, a point-by-point fix for all the problems King John had been causing. And this table just lays it out so perfectly. For every abuse of power, the charter had an answer. The king was throwing people in jail on a whim? Okay, Clause 39 says, nope, from now on, no free man can be imprisoned without a fair trial by his peers. He was inventing new taxes whenever he felt like it? Clause 12 says, not without the consent of the kingdom's leading barons. And, to make sure he actually followed through, Clause 61 set up a council of 25 barons to enforce the whole thing, with force, if necessary. I mean, think about that. This was absolutely revolutionary. But, and this is a really big but, as a peace treaty, the Magna Carta was a total and complete failure. King John had zero intention of following it, and he immediately got his buddy, the Pope, to declare the whole thing illegal. Within 3 months, the country was deep in a civil war. It really looked like the Great Charter was dead on arrival. So if it failed so spectacularly right out of the gate, why are we still talking about it more than 800 years later? Because even though the treaty itself failed, the idea behind it, well, that was just too powerful to disappear. And that's where its true legacy begins. That powerful idea is what we now call the rule of law. It's this simple but radical concept that the law is king, not the other way around. That no one, not a monarch, not a president, not a prime minister, is above the law. That single principle is pretty much the foundation of modern democracy as we know it. And you can literally see this idea echoing through the centuries. King John died shortly after, and the charter was actually reissued several times. But its real power came from how future generations picked it up and used it. In the 1600s, it was used as a weapon against kings during the English Civil Wars. In 1776, American colonists pointed to its principles to justify their own revolution. And in the 20th century, its spirit helped shape the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What started as a list of complaints for medieval barons transformed into this global symbol of liberty. And that brings us right back to today. The barons of 1215 created a document because they needed a way to hold their king accountable to the law. That struggle, that idea, it isn't locked away in medieval England. It raises a huge question for all of us. If the law is supposed to be the ultimate authority, if the law is king, then who holds the law itself accountable? Who makes sure it stays just and fair? That's definitely something to think about.